Hello, welcome to today's Cyber Threat Alliance webinar with John Heimerl of NTT, where we'll be discussing NTT's 2021 Global Threat Intelligence Report. The Cyber Threat Alliance is a nonprofit organization that brings cybersecurity companies together to share information on cyber threats so they can provide a better collective defense for their customers, disrupt malicious cyber actors, and elevate the cyber ecosystem. I'm Neil Jenkins, the Chief Analytic Officer of CTA, and I work with our members to ensure and improve the quality of the threat intelligence that they share and coordinate joint analysis and operational collaboration opportunities across members. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
John Heimerl. I'm the Senior Manager of the Threat Intelligence Communication Team from the Global Threat Intelligence Center within NTT. My group's goal is to do communication of consumable threat intelligence. So we publish emerging threat advisories, security bulletins, monthly reports, white papers, and then the culmination of our annual analysis is the Global Threat Intelligence Report, which we're going to call GTIR, because if we say a Global Threat Intelligence Report every time, it's going to be add 15 minutes to our presentation.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. So as John mentioned, we'll be discussing the GTIR today and talking about the main findings. If you have any questions as we go through the webinar, we encourage you to type them into the Q&A window that you should see at the bottom of your Zoom window. And we'll do our best to get to them during the webinar. But if we don't, we'll try and follow up with you via email after the webinar is over. So we'll go ahead and get started. So John, can you introduce the report and talk about how NTT puts it together each year?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Neil. So the big complexity of the Global Threat Intelligence Report, the GTIR, is probably the sheer amount of data and type of data that goes into the report. We have 15,000 security engagements from clients over 57 countries. We use data from 150 cybersecurity advisory assessments. We use monitoring and analysis data from our global network of security operations centers. We use research data from our 7 R&D centers from around the world, and we combine all this into our global threat intelligence platform where we consolidate and gather and correlate the information. Looking at the data is basically it's a 5-step process, basically. So we gather the security log, alert, event, and attack information from the SOCs, and that's the monitoring, that's the core monitoring data. We look at the cybersecurity advisory data, which is a professional services consultant engagement, which helps get the current score and the goal score of how its organization wants to the current practices and how tight they want to be to protect themselves. We gather application security data. This is data from White Hat Security, which is application testing data based on finding vulnerabilities in organizational applications. We gather collaboration and expert insight from strategic alliances such as the Cyber Threat Alliance and Europol. On top of that, we do our own global primary research. This is industry and security research that we conduct ourselves. Then we combine all of these sources to look at the data from different points of view to try to get a better understanding of the data and to see how the data relates from those different points of view.
So John, can you talk a little bit more about how your membership in CTA helped with this data analysis?
Yeah, so I think that actually the data received through the CTA partnership it's pretty invaluable in really providing context to the data we gathered. And we look at the data from our point of view. Most of these sources are data we get, but the CTA data really helped us identify topic areas to focus on for data analysis, like things to look for or potential observations. If you think about processing the GTIR data as kind of a scientific method, a certain amount of the data it's kind of built on hypothesis to prove or disprove. So we say, what do we want to find? Is what we think going to be true? Is what we think going to be not true? And do that validation process. So the biggest value in the CTA data was to really help find additional data sources of validation to merely make sure that we were using quality data.
That's great. Thanks. Really appreciate that. And we appreciate you all's membership in CTA, and we're glad that it is working for you here. So can you talk a little bit about some of the key findings in the report? What do you think are some of the most important takeaways?
Yeah, so we looked at a lot of data, right? And not all the data made it into the report, and not all the report we can make in a presentation that we can actually reasonably talk through in half an hour or 45 minutes. So what we really try to do is we try to take a look at, if we look at the data we thought was most important, how do I distill those down? We came up with 6 bullets, which I'll kind of walk through quickly, and then I think we'll go through a little more detail as we go through them. And the first one being industries in line of fire. We really saw a focus on attacks against finance, manufacturing, healthcare above all others. We saw attackers change the way they really thought about malware, and we saw miners and Trojans increase, and spyware go down, and we saw more focus on the type of malware being used, and we'll explain that better. We saw a huge increase in cryptocurrency mining. XMRig, coin miners were 41% of all malware, and XMRig accounted for 82% of all coin mining. We saw COVID-19 really kind of give attackers something to focus on, so they really used COVID-19 as a lure and a way to embolden themselves to identify targets. We saw compliance regulations kind of drag a little bit as operational requirements kind of served as a distraction from the compliance initiatives. We did see some initiatives on compliance initiatives worth talking about. And we saw a big change in the way work from home and remote access really helps magnify attacks. And that's one worth definitely talking about a little bit more. So first one being industries in line of fire. So really we saw attackers focus on these top 3 industries globally. I mean, it's finance, manufacturing, healthcare became the most targeted industries. We saw a small increase in overall attack volumes, not a significant increase. We did see an increase in attack volume. And the fact that we saw a 300%, nearly 300% increase in attack volume targeting manufacturing, more than 200% increase in attack volume targeting healthcare, and about a 50% increase in attacks targeting finance. So we saw a huge increase in attacks in these 3 industries, which really didn't equate to just more attacks in these industries. It equated to more shifting from other industries to these 3 industries. So we saw a real focus on these 3 industries as the attackers, from the attackers.
That's really interesting. And I think, COVID-19 and the pandemic will clearly be a theme throughout this discussion, but we can see how attacks on those top 3 industries that you mentioned, finance, manufacturing, and healthcare, could be tied to the important role that they played during the pandemic. And I also noted in your report that finance has been either number 1 or number 2 on your list in the last 3 years. But do you think this targeting that's against manufacturing and healthcare is here to stay, or do you believe things will shift as we kind of get back to normal?
Yeah, so in security world, as you know as well as I do, there's no simple answer in a process. But I think realistically, if we think about the way we see an industry being attacked, we typically see there's like about 7 industries that bubble through the top 5. And manufacturing, healthcare, and finance are always in that top 7, and they've often been in the top 5. So given where we are as far as what attackers have been focusing on, I would be surprised if we saw a huge shift in attacks. I mean, there's definitely a shift towards these attacks enough that attackers are really saying, these are the targets I want to attack because I'm getting a good return on investment. I've got value in what I'm attacking. They've got good stuff they got good things for me to attack and get data out of, and those attacks are being productive. So I wouldn't be surprised there's some shifting, but I would be surprised based on what we're seeing if we saw a huge shift away from these 3 because of the success attackers have been having.
It makes a lot of sense. So what trends are you seeing in the types of malware that are affecting your customers?
There's a couple of things we've seen in malware. I think the big thing we've seen in the changing face of malware is the way we are seeing malware being used in organizations. So last year in 2019, spyware was the most common malware. And in 2020, we saw a shift to that. So coin miners and spyware were the most, coin miners replaced spyware as the most common malware globally. Coin miners and Trojans were the most common in Americas and EMEA, and botnets and Trojans were the most common in APAC. So we saw a shift to somewhat towards away from some of the spyware we saw used into other malware variants. And part of that was a kind of it would look like a pretty good shift away from common malware being used everywhere. I mean, historically, we've seen a lot of the same type of malware in every geography, in every industry. And not a perfect match, but we've seen much more variety in the way things are being used, much more consistency in the way things are being used. And this year we saw more variety. No single malware appeared in the top 10 list for every industry, which was a big change for us to see that there's more, I guess that's maybe more specialization in the way malware was being used. For instance, worms were the most common malware in finance and manufacturing. Trojans were the most common in healthcare. Coin miners were the most common in education. And ransomware was the most common in technology.
So I'm really surprised by that point that each industry in your analysis has its own most common malware, and that the single malware didn't appear in the top 10 lists. Can you talk a bit more about why that was the case? Are the systems being used in those industries that different? Do the industries tend to have different sets of vulnerabilities, or is it something about the actors making conscious efforts and targeting specific industries? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Neil, if that's a multiple point question, multiple answer question, that's kind of the right answer is D, all of the above. So first of all, I think that does not mean no malware was ever used never used in every industry. While the numbers show that no malware was highly used against everyone, some malware appeared in the several top 10 lists, and most malware appeared in everybody's top 20 list. Now, in some cases, that means pretty low numbers, but they were still being, the different malware variants and malware families were still being used across all of the industries. If we look at maybe the top 20 malware, we see way more common elements than we saw in the top 10. There's a little bit of everything based on what we've seen historically. It certainly appears that attackers have been using malware, which they feel is more effective against their targets. So we feel it shows enough specialization in the malware and the way attackers are using that malware that we thought it showed enough trend that was important issue.
Interesting. And one other point I'd like to ask here is, you mentioned ransomware being the most common thing in technology, and maybe I'm showing too much recency bias here, a little bit of PTSD from the last couple of months, but I don't see much mention of ransomware in the report. So there definitely seemed to be an uptick in ransomware and big payouts throughout 2020. Obviously, we've seen big events like Colonial Pipeline and JBS in 2021. So where did ransomware fall in this analysis?
Yeah, ransomware is kind of an interesting problem child. So we saw a lot more coin mining than we saw ransomware, I mean, dramatically. But we did see a lot of ransomware last year. We actually saw quite a bit. Ransomware detections increased about 50% from 2019 to 2020, which was still hundreds of thousands of ransomware detections. Those numbers are a little bit misleading because how big and visible ransomware and ransomware attack can be. So, I mean, like I said, we saw way more illicit coin mining than we saw ransomware. But if an organization could have hundreds or maybe thousands of servers infected with coin miners and maybe not know about it. If you're having a ransomware problem because of what ransomware is, you know about it. And not only that, but everyone else knows about it. So a ransomware outbreak is more serious and more visible than many other types of breaches. So even if there is less ransomware than other threats, it feels like there's more because outbreaks are so big, so visible, and so damaging to a victim.
Very good point. So let's talk about that kind of invisible threat from coin mining, which it seems like you saw a ton of in 2020.
Yeah, so the coin miners really blew up last year. I mean, we saw a huge increase in coin mine value, miner digital currency value, and some of the popular bitcoins. Cryptocurrency grew 300, 400% in value. And that helped create a shift towards return on investment to attackers using coin miners to help create income. Coin miners accounted for 41% of all malware detected in 2020, which is a big increase. XMRig alone, it's a valid coin miner, but used illicitly, accounted for nearly 82% of all coin mining activity, and was the single most detected malware in the Americas and in EMEA. Coin miners were 23% of all malware in the Americas and 74% of all malware in EMEA. XMRig and coin miners especially hit the education industry hard, and XMRig alone was 62% of all malware detected in the education industry.
Those are some really amazing numbers. In 2018, CTA released a joint analysis on illicit cryptocurrency mining, where we tried to call attention to this issue, where we hoped that improvements in cyber hygiene and overall cybersecurity would reduce coin mining significantly, and it would also have the side effect of making other more disruptive attacks more difficult to conduct. In that report, we called illicit cryptocurrency mining the canary in the coal mine, right? If you have mining going on, you almost certainly have other problems that might be worse because of the vulnerability or the security posture that you had that allowed the coin mining to get there in the first place. So do you find that to be true? Do networks with miners present generally mean that other malware is present?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you're exactly right, and I think describing it as the canary in the coal mine is kind of the perfect analogy. So there's two issues with coin mining, right? So first of all, we still talk to people who are like, coin miners, I don't care. And I've talked to organizations who had coin miners in their environment, and they're not worried about it. It's only a coin miner. But with the complexity of malware and the way multifunction malware has grown up in the last 2 to 3 years, a coin miner is rarely just a coin miner. You get a coin miner with keyboard logging, with worm functionality, with remote access Trojan functionality. And maybe it's the coin mining part of that malware that is really running in your environment, but there's other parts to that. There's often other parts to that malware. The second part is if someone has put coin miner malware in your environment, that malware got there somehow. And if they got coin miner there, what's to say they didn't get something else? And with the multifunction malware being so prevalent right now, the chances are if you have coin miner in your environment, that you have something else in your environment has to be pretty high. So I think it's definitely worth treating cryptocurrency miners, coin miners, as a symptom of a bigger problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've alluded to it a couple of times so far, but let's talk about what was obviously the biggest story of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic. And then specifically, let's talk a little bit about what you all saw and how it affected cybersecurity.
Yeah, so COVID-19, more than anything, it really helped give attackers something to focus on and think about as they structure attacks. So we saw a huge increase in lures, social engineering, phishing attacks related to COVID-19. I mean, COVID-19 did not exist in the previous year. So the amount of attacks we saw related to COVID-19 was huge. It also helped give attackers, hostile threat actors, something to focus on as well. Attacking targets that are active in COVID-19 prevention or active in adapting their world to the new marketplace, new virtual marketplace, healthcare, technology, education, media, finance, all those organizations that were truly trying to rebuild their businesses to work differently. And COVID-19 really helped attackers define what their targets were and using COVID-19 kind of as that focus point.
That's really interesting. So clearly it affected the infrastructure that attackers were targeting, right? With more companies moving to work from home and web applications. We'll talk about that a little bit more on a later slide. But how did it affect who was targeted and why they were being targeted? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think the big issue on who was being targeted is the way companies had to adapt to the COVID-19 as it affected their business. The new working environment, expanding their virtual workplaces, working from home, setting up virtual digital environments, adding new portals, customer portals, user portals, vendor partners portals, partner portals, increase remote communications. And a lot of these are more external connection points, external access points, if you will, that attackers get more visibility. So a lot of these organizations are raising their security profile because they're giving the attacker more places to attack them, and attackers were taking advantage of that.
Interesting. So it's clear that throughout all of this, privacy and protection of user data just became ever more important throughout 2020. So why don't we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so compliance initiatives kind of I want to say stalled, but suffered a little bit as organizations really put emphasis on their new operations. If I'm a company, I'm worried about reaching clients, supporting users, continuing my business during a pandemic when I'm not having people come to my store or whatever that it means for a virtual or digital infrastructure. I'm going to probably worry less about compliance if I can get away with it. And we saw that within organizations, and we saw compliance groups, compliant bodies, government bodies, probably lighten the bootstraps a little bit on compliance regulations and compliance initiatives. So I think overall, we saw a little bit of a kind of distraction from compliance initiatives to the extent where they were in previous years.
Yeah, it's totally understandable, right? With all of the things that folks had to do to change their operations. But throughout all of this, do you think that we're going to be able to see compliance actions be put behind where they need to be as we move forward?
Yeah, I think we saw that a little bit. But I think the big difference that COVID-19 had was it really kind of helped, I guess, invigorate or highlight some of the privacy type issues. Things like employee privacy while remote working, patient privacy while supporting content tracking and outbreak information, employer privacy and employee privacy while extending the workplace into the employee living room, customer privacy with the increase in online shopping, educator and student privacy with online classes. These types of initiatives really kind of helped reinforce, if you will, that privacy has to be a real driver. And I think we've seen the single biggest area we saw compliance initiatives move last year was in privacy regulations. For instance, the California Consumer Privacy Act was passed last year, and that's going to likely serve as a impetus and example for a lot of other privacy acts moving forward.
And so I think that's a pretty good segue to your last major point, talking about how working from home and remote applications ended up changing the attack surface of organizations and how that affected their cybersecurity.
Yeah, so I think one of my biggest issues I thought was, application-specific and web application attacks have historically been big types of attacks. So they're some of the most common types of attacks we've seen year after year after year looking at GTIR data. They've historically been the top two or three attack types throughout all the analysis. I think the big difference we saw this year was that application-specific and web application attacks combined this year in 2020 to account for 67% of all attacks, over 2/3. And think about what those attacks are. Those are the attacks that are attacking your web presence. They're attacking the web portal. They're attacking your website. They're attacking the parts of your company that the attacker can get to from the outside world that are internet enabled. They're attacking the applications themselves. They're attacking the underlying technology. They're attacking the databases that are used to support your environment. They're basically all those things to break your web presence and get access to your servers or access to your data behind the server. And the fact we saw those increase from 32% of attacks in 2018 to 67%, that's more than double in 2 years, is where we saw the focus of application-specific and web application attacks. And if we think about what those attacks are also focusing on as far as the technology point, things like Think PHP, PHP Unit, zero shell network services, D-Link devices, those are a lot of technologies, again, which are the web-enabled technology that are supporting the web presence and web access or remote access of organizations. So what we can see from the combination of attacks here is that attackers are really targeting what organizations are using now. It's application-specific web application attacks targeting the web presence and the technology that support our websites, portals, or remote connections that businesses are really using to keep their business running, to keep communicating with users, partners, and customers.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It really shows that threat actors are going to find the vulnerabilities and gaps in the infrastructure that you've set up. And so if you're setting up new infrastructure, you can't skip out on securing it. So now that we've covered those broader trends, let's talk a little bit about some specific insights related to specific industry verticals.
Yeah, so I have three industries I want to talk about really quickly. And I think if you look at the left side here, you can see the application specific and web application attacks are the dominant types of attacks in all the top three industries we looked at. I mean, in finance, they're 73% of all attacks. In manufacturing, they're 69% of all attacks. And in healthcare, web application specific attacks are 97% of all attacks we saw. So attackers are really taking advantage of the current world and really focusing on those types of attacks that give them the best access to environments. On the malware side, we can see we saw a lot of variety in the type of malware we saw, and we didn't see any malware in common in the top three across industries. And again, each industry saw its own version of what was important in each industry.
I have to point out, you've got Conficker listed as most common malware in finance, which is just, I think we'll always have Conficker, but I'm just surprised by it being in that sector. Is that just legacy systems which haven't been patched, or is there something more to it than that?
I think the chances are that that's legacy systems that haven't been patched. I mean, there's still been a lot of consolidation going on in the finance industry in the last several years. So if you are a bank which bought a bank which bought a bank, and you're the third, fourth, or fifth bank down that process, it would not be at all surprising to see the organization is not prioritized, finding, isolating, and updating all those legacy applications. So realistically, if a Conficker is in the environment or is being detected in the environment, chances are that is going to be a legacy application.
That's amazing that those things are still around, but that's just the environment we live in, right?
Yep.
So why don't we move on to the recommendation? So we've talked quite a bit about the findings. Do you all in NTT have recommendations for things that organizations can do to help protect themselves from this hostile activity?
Yeah, so we have a series of recommendations. I mean, if I sit here and try to give customized recommendations for every industry, it would be pretty hard. But I think if we look at the types of things we saw in the GTIR and for data to protect yourselves from the types of threats we saw in the GTIR, I think I have a list of 5 recommendations, high-level recommendations that if you think about these types of things, you can protect yourselves from what we saw as the bigger threats in the GTIR. The first one being position cybersecurity as a key business component. I mean, make security requirements part of your basic business function. You set up a new environment, setting up a new system. Security of that application should be part of that basic fundamentally business requirement. The second one being prioritize people and process. And I want to stress the fact that the people are one of your biggest asset. And we're not trying to make people into security experts. We don't need to make, everybody does not need to be a security geek. What we need to do as across all industries, we need to make sure we are equipping people with the proper tools, process, awareness, training that we are enabling people to do their jobs in at least a security aware manner, so they can do their jobs correctly, successful, and at least understand the security implications of the things they're working on. We really embrace security by design. It's not just saying I'm going to include security as a business component, but I'm going to keep going back to my security requirements and my security initiatives and reinforce my security and see how can I, every step through my development process, through my design process, through my build process, I'm going to keep going back to security as a basic building block and move those forward. The fourth one being prioritizing continuous monitoring. The best answer I have for this one is you're never going to be able to react to what you can't see. So if you're not watching for something, you're not going to see it. So the more monitoring you can do to the point where you can see something as it happens, it increases your chance to take proactive actions to eliminate a breach or to mitigate a breach before it actually becomes worse. And the last one being adopt existing frameworks and standards. I mean, most organizations have at least some work to do in their environment to protect themselves, improve their security controls, and improve their security maturity. Don't reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of standards and frameworks that already exist, tested, tried and true. Use those standards and frameworks to help build your security program around and reinforce what you want to do instead of starting from scratch.
Thank you. So that was a lot of really good information in a short amount of time. Did you have one key finding that you thought was most important?
Yeah, but I think if I didn't talk about all these, I mean, it'd be unfair because I think to an extent all of them are important. But if you make me pick one, I'm going to say that the application security and web application attacks, dominating attacks by such a large margin, is probably the most important, and it's probably more important than people really initially give it credit for. The share of these attacks has doubled in the last 2 years, more than doubled, and it really shows that attackers are taking advantage of the web presence of organizations, their websites, applications, portals, and that these attacks are succeeding often enough that the attackers are going to keep using them. It really drives home the point that attackers are targeting the parts of the organization that are the most important to organizations' continued business in our current conditions, and that unless something changes, we should expect the same type of activity to continue. How about you, Neil? Do you have anything that really struck you as more compelling than something else?
I think that, all the findings on their own are really interesting, but I think the common thread between them all was that 2020 and the way we all had to adjust the way we work and the way organizations had to adjust the way that they got infrastructure to their employees really showed us how flexible and resilient we all have to be, and that real world physical events such as a global pandemic will affect businesses and security decisions in unexpected ways. We have to be nimble. We have to be quick in our threat sharing to protect organizations in our care. And organizations have to make adjustments for their environments with security in mind. I think that was the biggest takeaway for me. So with that, I think it's time to wrap up the webinar. But before we sign off, I would like to take a second and make one other plug. CTA pulled together a working group of our members back in 2019 to look at the threats to the 2020 Olympics that are going to be held in Tokyo in a couple of weeks. And NTT was a big part of that group. We put out a threat assessment for the Olympics that addressed the various threat actors and risks that could affect the operations of the games. And we recently updated it at the beginning of May to accommodate for any changes that we saw that took place due to the pandemic. We'd certainly like to thank NTT for their participation in that working group and direct folks to the updated threat assessment that's on our website if you'd like more information. So thanks again to everyone for attending today's webinar. Thanks to John and the NTT for participating. We encourage you to check out NTT's website, hello.global.ntt, where you can download and review the 2021 Global Threat Intelligence Report for yourself. And if you have questions about CTA or if you're interested in membership, please visit cyberthreatalliance.org and we can help you out from there. Otherwise, have a good day and stay safe. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.